mai e te tipua, mai e te tawhito, mai e te kāhui o ngā ariki, tūtapa mai nuku, tūtapa mai rangi, tūtapa ko te mauri ahu mai no te ahu rewa, oi ka mau noa te tapu, oi ka mau noa te mauri, oi te ororo, oi te ororo. A tēnā koutou katoa e tāringa whakarongo mai anō kia mātou I tēnei wā, nau mai, hara mai, tiki mai, ki te whakāturanga tuarua o te aho tāhuhu. Koutou mā, ānei te pai, ta pai mātauranga mo tēnei haora. Nō reira koutou e tāringa whakarongo mai rana, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou, mai tēnei taha o te matapihi, rāra ko te tuāpapa kura kāinga e mihi atu nei kia koutou I tēnei wā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. Well, welcome back to the second in a series of webinars that are being presented by the partnership of Te Tuāpapa Kura Kāinga, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and Te Matapihi, the Māori Housing Network. It's my honour and privilege to present to you today. My name's Mark Ormsby, and today we're going to present the PHO products. As part of the first webinar, we explained the 6 criteria that were needed to become a provider in the PHO space. And one of those criteria was to have an understanding of the PHO products. So today we've got the gurus of each of those products here to talk to you a little bit about what they do. So nō reira koutou mā, we're going to go straight away to our first speaker, my manager Malo Ayu. Tēnā koe Malo, ānei te wā ki a koe.
Kia ora, Mark. He mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa ka puta mai mō tēnei webinar. Ko ai au, ko Malo Ayu tōku ingoa, he whakapapa ahau ki toklao rawa ko Hāmoa. Ko au te kaiwhakahare mō te tima PHO I roto te Tuāpapa Kura Kāinga. Thank you and welcome this morning. Thank you, Mark. I'm just going to briefly cover at a high level around progressive home ownership before I hand over to the other panelists to talk about their products in general or in depth. So just to recap, the progressive home ownership enables individuals and whānau to partner with an approved progressive home ownership provider to help them become homeowners by addressing the deposit barrier and sharing the cost of home ownership. The PHO fund aims to support individuals and whānau who are unlikely to buy a home without a reasonable amount of support, both financial and non-financial, and can afford a mortgage payments but are constantly chasing the market in terms of saving a deposit, or families who can get a small deposit together but are not able to afford the ongoing cost of a mortgage at current house prices. The PHO fund is a $400 million investment that enables approved PHO providers to take a 15-year loan from the government, then partner with individuals and whānau to help them access home ownership opportunities through arrangements such as shared ownership, rent to buy, or leasehold. The PHO fund also has a specific aim to address housing affordability for 3 priority groups: Māori, Pasifika peoples, and families with children. As discussed at the first webinar, there are 3 pathways that individuals and whānau can come through to access progressive home ownership. The provider pathway is the first one. The second one is Te Ao Taketake, which is for iwi Māori providers, and the government pathway through Kāinga Order, which is called First Home Partner. And just to reiterate the point that each pathway has a set amount, has an amount set aside for that. For the provider pathway, there was $87 million available. And for the Te Ao Taketake pathway, there was $87 million available also in that pathway. For the government pathway, there is a facility of up to $187 million available in that pathway. If the provider pathway or Te Ao Taketake pathway is oversubscribed, then we can look at getting some money from the government pathway to shore that up. As discussed at the first webinar, again, there were those 3 pathways for the whānau to come through. I understand the First Home Partner pathway will be covered in a webinar by itself. All pathways enable approved PHO providers to take a 15-year loan from the government and then partner with households to help them with their deposit or share the cost of home ownership by, again, accessing the 3 products that the providers could offer, such as shared ownership, rent-to-buy or leasehold arrangements. The key point is the relationship that Te Tuapapa Kura Kāinga, or the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, has in the progressive home ownership space is not with the individuals or whānau themselves. It is with the approved providers. And that is the right approach, as the providers in the provider pathway or Te Ao Taketake pathway, in all cases, have worked with individuals or whānau over a number of months or years, getting them ready for home ownership. Our role is to provide a loan to approved providers so that they can create more opportunities for whānau and individuals to purchase their own homes. For individuals or whānau that are coming through the government pathway, first home partner, the relationship they have with Kāinga Audit is different, as those clients do not normally require the non-financial support or active case management to get their clients over the line. Those clients can service a standard mortgage, but only need the extra help of getting a deposit. For the providers, there is funding maxima that we will provide for each application, and that is as follows. The fund can lend up to 45% on shared equity schemes and up to 50% on rent-to-buy or leasehold. The amount of a loan for a shared equity product is based on the purchase price of the house, in which the household buys a majority share. So the key thing for shared equity is that the household should own the majority share there, so at least 55%. The amount of loan for rent to buy or leasehold scheme is based on the cost to the provider of building the home or contracting a builder or developer to deliver the home. Because most requests for funding are based around planned development or buildings under construction, it is only possible to estimate the market value on completion. So therefore, we generally rely on the total estimated build costs, including land or contracted prices with builders or developers to set the maximum loan amount. So that's just a bit for the providers themselves to understand when they're putting in their applications. I would now like to acknowledge my co-contributors this morning and recognise the work them and their organisations have been doing in this space for a number of years. In order for the Progressive Home Ownership program to be a success, we need to partner with our providers to create more opportunities for individuals and whānau to purchase their own homes. Thank you, Mark.
Tēnā koe, Malo. Thank you for that. Hoi anō whānau, we're going to move over to our next speaker, the first of our three amazing gurus today. We're going to have Julie Scott, who's from the Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust, who will be talking about the PHO product, the leasehold model. Tēnā koe, Julie.
Kia ora, Mark. As you said, Julie Scott from the Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust. So this is, we call our leasehold product the Secure Home Program. Now, we launched this 2 years ago after doing another progressive home ownership model, that shared ownership program, for about 10 years. There's a couple of reasons why we moved from shared ownership to secure home, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the basic premise of this leasehold model, secure home, is that the trust owns the land in perpetuity. And essentially what we do is we sell the improvements or the home to the household. So they buy a lease to the property with their own mortgage and deposit. And the purchase price of that lease is the cost of the construction. So therefore, that's why I say they essentially buy the improvements, they buy the building. So we're separating out the land from the improvements. Now, the household pays a ground rent to the land, which is currently set at 1.5% of land value. So if you're talking about a $350,000 section, they're paying about $100 a week. There is the ability to be flexible with that percentage, and that's up to, I guess, each organisation what they set it at. If land values got really high, we might look to reduce that percentage down even further. So now, because we own the land in perpetuity, so we retain the freehold title of the land for the community in perpetuity. The bank has security because the bank, obviously, who's lending to the household needs some form of security. So they have security against the leasehold title for the purchaser's mortgage. So the really key components to this leasehold program are that it's a 100-year lease and the ground rent only ever goes up with inflation. So that it says their CPI, that's Consumer Price Index. So it's only ever going to go up with inflation for the period that that household is in there. So in theory, the household could stay in there for 100 years, and each year it only ever moves, the ground rent only ever moves with inflation. If the household wants to sell for whatever reason, they may be in a better situation. They may be moving out of the district, whatever it is, but they have to sell back to us and we have to buy it off them. That's the agreement there. So whenever they want to sell, we have to buy it back off them. And the purchase price that we buy it back off of them from is determined by the original purchase price plus inflation for the period they've been in there. So again, we're tracking things to inflation and the wild fluctuations of the property market, which, as everyone knows, typically goes up, but can also go down. We want to take those fluctuations and uncertainty away from the household and give them some certainty. And we can do that more with inflation than we can with the property market. Now, improvements to the property can be made by the household. Improvements can be made by the household, and as long as they're approved by the trust, then we'll incorporate those improvements into the resale value. So when we buy back, so if they've spent $10,000 putting on a debt, we say, okay, that's a great outcome, we're happy with that, and we'll include that when you sell back to us, we'll include that in the price. So it encourages people to treat it like their own home, make improvements, look after it really well. It is their own home, so of course they're going to treat it like that. At the moment, the banks do require a household to have 20% deposit. However, we've got around that with use of the first home loan. So that's the government's first home loan scheme where people can get in with a minimum of 5%. People can also use their KiwiSaver, and the Home Start Grant can be applied. So we're seeing that being used in most of the circumstances now by households, and it's of huge value. Here's a little example of how it could work. So this is a house that we're actually building down in Lake Hayes Estate in Queenstown. It's costing $380,000 to build. Now that's total turnkey product. So we're talking about carpets, drapes, full landscaping, fencing, the works. Now a household, let's say they've got 10% deposit, so they come to us with their $38,000 deposit. They get a mortgage, $342,000. They're buying the cost of construction, they're buying in at $380,000. There's no margin on that. That's what it cost us to build, and that's what we're selling it to the household for. Now, if we look at that, this is based on interest rates at 2.5%. So they've probably gone up a little bit by then, but let's just think that they're 2.5% at the moment. So their mortgage repayments would be $355 a week. Their rates, insurance, maintenance, let's say $100 a week, and their ground rent, again, let's say $100. So in total, their weekly outgoings are around $550, $555 a week. Now we look at that and you compare that to renting the same property on the open market, it's at least $650 a week. Probably now rents are starting to creep up. We're probably looking at around $750 a week for a 3-bedder. So to us and to households, it's an absolute no-brainer to be paying off your own mortgage, paying down principal, have that security of tenure of a 100-year lease, knowing that you're never going to be kicked out, and have all the other rights and benefits of home ownership. To us, it's a no-brainer. So we have this little catch cry. We like to say it's a nest, not a nest egg, because the household has all the benefits and responsibilities of home ownership, except the ability to make large capital gains. That's the key difference, because everything's tracking to inflation rather than the property market, they don't have the ability to make large capital gains. If there's any capital growth, it stays with the trust. And of course, the house remains in the community in perpetuity, because when they sell back to us and we sell to the next household. This is where we launched back in, it was about 2.5 years ago now. 6 little houses here, Churwell Lane. These were the first 6 to go through into our secure home program. Earlier this year, we completed this one over in Wanaka. Again, we put 4 into our secure home program and 2 into rentals. So when we do developments, we do like a mixed tenure model. We like some rentals, some assisted ownership. Sometimes it's public housing, sometimes it's rent to buy. It can be a mixture within the rentals. And this is the Toru apartments in Frankton in Queenstown. We purchased 50 from the developer. We ended up selling 8 of them on the open market to fund the rest, and we put 26 into our secure home program. So 26 of these went into leasehold. There was some questions about whether we could do apartments under a leasehold model, but we certainly got around that. We got excellent government support, PHO funding to enable us to do this. And we've got 26 very happy households in their secure home program, in their own homes, who would previously have never been able to afford to get into home ownership of any kind. The purchase price on these units, because the apartments, was a little bit lower, and so they ended up, some of them were getting in at a starting price of around 200,000, so significantly lower. So the key takeaways for this program, and I'm happy to take Q&A later, of course, but is that the land is separated out from the buildings and then it's held in perpetuity by the trust. So that's really important for a lot of organisations like Māori iwi, councils perhaps, and others who want to provide an assisted ownership model but don't want to sell the land and can't quite figure out how to do it. This is a really great model for these people, organisations. And obviously, household buys in at the cost of construction. There's no margin on there. What it costs to build is what they pay. And then they pay a below market ground rent on the land, which only ever increases with inflation. So they get that security of tenure through a 100-year lease, and they get security of permanent affordability by knowing that their ground rent's only ever going to go up with CPI. Yep, that's my contact details. That's it. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Julie, mō tērā kōrero kia mātou I tēnei wā. Whānau, there is a question for you, Julie. I've got a few for you. If the bank uses the land as security, does that mean the trust is taking on the liability for the mortgage?
No, so what we do is we create a leasehold title from the freehold title. So the trust retains ownership of that freehold title and the bank takes security on the leasehold title. So the bank doesn't have security over the land itself.
Another question, Julie, what has the uptake of this leasehold model been like from your waiting list?
Yeah, so initially there was a little bit of resistance to it because people previously understood we'd offered a shared ownership model for the last 10 years very successfully, and people understood that a lot better than leasehold. It was more familiar to them, and they could also understand with shared ownership that they could make capital gains, whereas they realise that with the leasehold model they don't have the ability to make capital gains. So at the start, there was a little bit of resistance, but we did a lot of work. I spent a lot of time talking to community groups, helping people understand. And then eventually when people realise that it's better than renting, that's the key, that you're in a far better position financially than if you stayed renting in the market, that's when the switch started happening and people started saying, okay, I can now see that this is a good stepping stone, and it may take me a little bit longer to get to independent ownership. And look, some people will never get to independent ownership. This will be their house for life, but that's fine. They've got 100 years. It can be their house for life.
Got a couple of more questions that are coming through right now, Julie. After the 100-year lease, does it go back to the trust?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So what happens is when the household sells back to us, and let's say it's 15 years, but it could be 100, but it's probably not going to be 100, let's be honest. Let's say it's 15 years. What we do is we then create a new 100-year lease for the next household. So every single household gets a new 100-year lease. So the lease never goes down like those old leases of years ago that have the bad rap in New Zealand. That doesn't happen.
How does the trust mitigate the risk of buying back these properties?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. So perhaps you're asking about maintenance. So there is a maintenance schedule that sits alongside the Secure Home Agreement. In the household, with the rights and responsibilities of home ownership comes maintenance. And so the households are expected to maintain the properties. We send around a property inspector annually. They'll come back with a few suggestions like they do, what needs to be fixed up, what maintenance needs to be done, and the household is required to do that. So there's provisions within the agreement to ensure that that happens.
Got a couple of other questions here and while we've got you talking, what happens in the event of a mortgagee sale?
So in the event, well, first of all, you've got to remember that the trust always has to buy the property back. That's the agreement that we have with the bank and with the household. So it would only ever go to a mortgagee sale if the trust wasn't in a position to buy the property back. And the likelihood of that is very, very low. The risk to that is low because currently we have 760 households on our waiting list. So we've got huge demand for these products. And we've also got, enough finances ourselves that we would be able to. But let's say, for example, that we actually were in a position where we didn't have anyone wanting to buy this particular property. We didn't have the cash at the time to buy it. In that situation, the bank has a right to sell the leasehold on the open market. So they can't sell, they can only sell the lease, not the freehold title. And they sell that without the restrictions of the Secure Home program. So we did a bit of work with the valuer around what that would look like, and the actual value of the lease goes up significantly if it's sold to the open market.
Does that impact your charitable status?
No, it doesn't.
And who pays for the legal fees of creating the leasehold title?
We pay for that. So the household, the upfront cost to the household would be there. Of course, they have to have independent legal representation. But in terms of creating the leasehold title, that's something that's covered by us.
One more question. I won't keep the others waiting. But if the leaseholder passes away, is the whānau entitled to take on the lease until the 100-year expiry?
Well, that would probably be a conversation that they would have to have with the bank, because remember that the leaseholder has a mortgage with the bank. So it would be up to the bank to say, we would be open to that if they were able to take on the mortgage and the bank was happy with that. But really, that would be a question for the bank, and it would depend, because obviously you can have, I can't imagine children being in a position to take on a mortgage, but if they're older and they have income coming in, then yes, perhaps that could quite well happen.
Tēnā koe, Julie. Thank you for your time. I'm going to shoot straight over to Dominic Foot, who's from the Housing Foundation. Tēnā koe, Dominic. Nei toa. Kia ora, Julie.
Kia ora, Mark. Kia ora koutou. Ko Dominic Foot, tuku ingoa. I'm the CEO of the Housing Foundation, a fairly well-established now in New Zealand community housing provider that focuses on helping whānau transition from renting into ownership. And we do that through two means. One is through a rent-to-own model, and the other one is through shared ownership. And what I'm going to do today is take you through the shared ownership model that we've, the foundation has had now in place since about 2007, and we've assisted over 250 whānau get into home ownership. So there's some principles around shared ownership, and these aren't just unique to the Housing Foundation. These are fairly applied across the world where shared ownership functions. Principally, affordability here is defined by household income, not by the price of the property. So when we do shared ownership, and I'll go through the mechanics of that in a later slide, what the whānau buys is a share in the home based on what they can afford, using 30% of their gross income to pay for their mortgage payments. That's really important. That means we're working on the basis of affordability. The other aspect to this is that the household income must come from employment, and they must be able to obtain a mortgage. So those are sort of the key principles around why and how shared ownership works. The deposit, this is where we tend not to, and this is the good thing about shared ownership, the banks have accepted the fact that whānau can come through with a deposit as low as 5% into shared ownership, because their mortgage on the property is actually over the whole property. So they secure the mortgage against the property. So if someone's buying 60% of a property, the bank has the mortgage over the whole property. So the mortgage exposure to the bank, the risk to the bank is actually very, very minimal. What that does, that drives down the deposit allowance or requirement for whānau, and that actually makes getting to home ownership significantly easier. They don't need to, whānau don't need to come up with 10% or 20% deposit to purchase into shared ownership. We work on the basis of 60% of the value of the property. We do, and we have sold equity shares or shares in the home to whānau as low as 55%. You would have heard Marlo say at the start about 55% is a sort of the threshold. The reason we aim at 55% and higher is because below that, it becomes cloudy as to who is the owner of the property, and therefore who is liable and who is responsible. So 55, 60% minimum purchase, and that's where we set out for shared ownership. The equity that's in the home, the foundation's money that is in the home that makes it the balance of the property that the family don't buy, is left in there by the Housing Foundation at no cost to whānau. So there is no interest, or there's no lease costs, there's no interest payments on the equity that we leave in the property. But what we do charge is an annual management fee, and I'll come into that later why we do that, but that is really there for us to run the program for the 15-year period. So shared ownership is based on what legally is known as a tenants in common ownership structure. That means basically that whānau and the Housing Foundation are equally on the title. So the house is jointly owned by both whānau and the Housing Foundation. And as I said earlier, that's really key for the banks, because it means that they've got security over the whole title. And in being a joint owner of the property, the Housing Foundation is basically saying to the bank, you have rights to that property in the event of a mortgage closure. However, the Housing Foundation has been running this now for 15 years. We've not had a single mortgage default. And the reason behind that is because we also give an underlying commitment to the bank that where there ever is a situation of mortgage default or the potential for a mortgage default, the foundation will step in and do two things. One is it will work alongside whānau to find out what's gone wrong and how can we help whānau stay in the home. Secondly, it means that we can actually step in and buy the share from whānau and pay back the bank's debt, the mortgage debt, and then work with the whānau in the home. And we've done that on 3 occasions now where families have lost their jobs. Not recent times, previously during the GFC that happened. And what we did there, we converted the shared ownership into affordable rentals. And in 2 of the 3 occasions, whānau, after a period of time, got back into shared ownership in their home. But the principle was they stayed in their home. As I said, it's tried and tested. It's been in New Zealand now for 14 years and longer. It's accepted by almost all the major banks. The ANZ aren't against it. It's just that they've been watching the government program to see which shared ownership agreement they would like to prioritise. They've now looked at both shared ownership agreements and realised that sort of the Kāinga Ora pathways and the Housing Foundation one are very, very similar. So we expect the ANZ to be a mortgagee of shared ownership sometime in 2022. It is used by iwi, it is used by Māori Housing Association, it's used by the Māori trustee through to Tumu Paro. Iwi, Waikato Tainui, Ngātahu, Point Nick, Nicholson Block Settlement Trust are all using the shared ownership agreement at the moment. And as I said, the Kāinga Ora shared ownership agreement is heavily based on it. And there's a reason why they all look the same in the end, and it's because of the banks. The banks influence quite heavily the structure and the requirements for them for lending into a shared ownership agreement. We've also got Reserve Bank approval for it, and that's really important because it was originally considered about 8 or 9 years ago as a way of getting around the loan to value constraints. Could we lend to a family into a home that normally they wouldn't be able to buy, but in lending to them and then buying the home, are we actually then breaching the loan to value? I.e., is our equity in the house a loan? And the Reserve Bank clearly said, no, it's not a loan, it's equity. And therefore, we're not actually breaching any loan to value requirements of the Reserve Bank. And this is just a graphic quite simply showing how we operate the shared ownership program. Final purchasers will deposit a mortgage. What they can purchase using the mortgage is based on what they can afford. They buy between 60 to 85% of the value of the property. The reason we cap it at 85% is that the likelihood is that if they can afford more than 85%, they can afford to buy an existing house in the community that they are buying into shared ownership. And the balance is what we own. So this is sort of a bit more of the sort of financial breakdowns. So you can see, and this is actually a real example of someone who's buying into one of our houses in South Auckland at the moment. The house is valued at 700,000. It's a 3-bed house. We've had a garage. It's in the terrace, 3 levels. House is valued at 700,000. Whānau can buy 455,000. They have a deposit of 25,000. So that's about 5% deposit. They can raise a mortgage of 430,000. They've got a gross income of 85. We own the balance. And as you can see there, the liability and the responsibility of the household is sort of the same as any homeowner. They pay council rates, they pay the house insurance, they have to maintain and repair the home, and they do pay us a yearly management fee. Now, the reason they pay us a yearly management fee is because during the 15-year shared ownership period, we're working with the family to enable them to buy our equity out. That's really the primary focus of shared ownership, is how can we help them purchase our equity. So at the end of the 15th year, they are the full owner of the home. And that requires us to spend quite a bit of time with whānau during those 15 years. And part of that time is actually helping them with financial plans. They'll put in place at the day they move in fact, prior to that, a financial plan that they've worked on with our support. And that helps them to predict and project into the future how and when they anticipate buying more equity. It's also used as a savings program, and it's also used for them for when the unexpected occurs. Because we all know that stuff happens to us. So over a 15-year period, who knows, you could see a reduction in income, separation, death, injury, anything that impacts and compounds someone's ability to earn money. The financial plan helps them navigate their way through it and to reset where they are going in terms of becoming a full owner. To date, all of our families have purchased within 12 years of moving into shared ownership, and our average turnaround time for a family to buy us out is now sitting at just under 7 years. So that's 7 years, that's from the day they purchase at shared ownership to the day they become a full owner. The household, the whānau, can buy our shares at any time. They can buy them anytime. We don't inhibit them, and we encourage incremental purchases or the full purchase. But the principle here is that they're always buying at value, the market value, and we get the shares valued when the family want to buy more equity, want to buy us out. A bit of a sort of a basic comparison. Now, if we were to sell that house in our Manukau development to the open market, it's priced at 700,000. That's its value. Family now need roughly 20% deposit. They'll have to raise a $560,000 mortgage. They'll be paying a mortgage of about $624 a week, or that's a gross income of 38% of their gross income if they're earning $85,000. But they actually need a deposit of $140,000 to do this. And that's nigh on impossible. KiwiSaver has been a brilliant instrument for people to be able to access deposits. But no one after 9 years, 10 years of using KiwiSaver is anywhere close to $140,000. So through shared ownership, the same whānau were able to buy 65% of the home, move in, own the home, pay the mortgage based at 30% of their income, deposits 25,000. That was one person's KiwiSaver and a Home Start grant coming through. And we own the balance. And we believe through the financial plan that the family have got that they are more than capable over 15 years of buying us out. So the main thing here is this is establishing affordability based on income. It's really important not to move for the foundation, not to move away from that principle. It gives renters the chance to own their own home, and as Julie said, in Queenstown it's the same thing in Auckland. Mortgage payments are below the rents that whānau are currently paying in South Auckland. And the living costs are substantially lower as well. These are new homes, Homestar 6, so they're warm, they're insulated, they're healthy. And the other principle, this is not, whilst this is a program that's come late to New Zealand, because it's only really been in the last 20 years that New Zealand struggled with a housing crisis and poor housing affordability. Globally, shared ownership's been in place since really before the mid-80s. In the mid-80s, it became very large in Europe. I think in the UK, last time I checked, something like 160,000 households are in shared ownership homes. Here, we've got less than 1,000. So it's been very late coming to the market, but it's there now, and it's starting to be understood. It's accepted by the banks. The legal fraternity understand it, and it certainly has a role to play now in helping families get into home ownership. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Dominic. Thank you for your presentation. Just got a couple of quick questions before we move on to Conrad. With increasingly high house prices, is shared ownership, in your opinion, still relevant in New Zealand?
Yes, it is. The question is asking, though, is actually who is it relevant for more than anything else? So when we started, we were working with whānau whose gross incomes were 65, 70,000 a year. Now we're working with whānau whose incomes at a minimum have to be 85,000. But what's happening, we're seeing obviously affordability becoming a problem, and we're talking more about Auckland, and I'll just move into the other part of the country in a second. But in Auckland, it's still very relevant for households with higher levels of income, because it is a means for them to get into ownership. But what it's doing, it's not helping whānau on lower levels of income. So it has a major relevancy. It helps whānau get through. It takes the pressure off the rental market, which is really important. So it has a role outside of the Auckland area, outside of areas like Tauranga, Queenstown. It still has quite a major role. We see areas like the Hawke's Bay, Waikato, parts of the Wellington region, Marlborough, elsewhere, Canterbury. Shared ownership really has a role to play there, because the house prices, whilst they're significantly higher than they were 5 years ago, they're still affordable for families that we're working with in Christchurch who are on 70,000, 65,000 to get into their first home.
Thank you, Dominic. I think you answered my second question about where shared home ownership works best. But I mean, if there's anything you want to add to that.
I think what we're seeing in New Zealand is the fact that shared ownership really has been constrained to sort of two areas, and there's Auckland and Queenstown. We're very small areas operating it elsewhere. And the issue that we're facing, it can work anywhere, but it hasn't got that public profile. So every time you go into a new place, it's actually got to be raised, it's got to be discussed, talked about, and it's got to be made accessible. So I think shared ownership can work anywhere, but it's also the publicity that's needed for it to be known and to be recognised.
Tēnā koe, Dominic. Thank you for your presentation. That was Dominic, the CEO of Housing Foundation. We're going to move quickly on to Conrad Lapointe, the CE for the Northern region. Tamaki makaurau tai atu ki te tai tokerau. Tēnā koe, Conrad. Anei toa.
Tēnā koe, Mark. Kia ora koutou. Yes, as I said, my name is Conrad, and it's my pleasure to introduce Habitat for Humanity's Rent to Own program for you. So Habitat has been delivering this product for over 25 years across Aotearoa. And what I'm going to do with my slides, I'm going to first of all just introduce really what the whānau journey is with us through that rent to own process. So at the start of the process, Habitat essentially secures a property. We either purchase the land and develop, or we'll purchase turnkey, and we own the property. We go through a selection process with whānau who have applied, and successful families will sign what we term a 10-year umbrella agreement that takes them all the way through to the process. So essentially, it's a 10-year relationship with whānau to get them into home ownership at the 10-year point or before, if they can make it. That pre-housing stage, I will talk about a little bit more in depth in following slides, but that onboarding process is extremely important. In the first 5 years, you have the umbrella agreement that's overarching, But essentially, the relationship is largely governed by tenancy agreements. The first 5 years is considered tenancy. At that point, when the whānau moves in, the price is agreed. I think, as Dominic alluded to earlier, because of the price points that we are seeing, it's not all, it used to be at what the market value was of that home. Now we are fortunately able to secure homes at lower than market value, or we give away the margin that we make on those properties if we develop ourselves to ensure that they are affordable for whānau. As it's a rental arrangement, essentially Habitat is the landlord, the family is the tenant, and that relationship holds for the first 5 years. And Habitat assumes the responsibilities that really any landlord would as it pertains to the property. Obviously, it's a little bit more technical than that, but I don't want to get into too much detail. Essentially, that is the tenant-landlord relationship. At the end of 5 years, if a whānau essentially has met what we would consider all the partnership obligations, then that is when the whānau can sign what we term a long-term sales and purchase agreement. They are then considered the purchaser in possession of that home. And then there's therefore another 5 years to keep paying down and hopefully secure that property. So at that 5 year point as well, if we assume from day one a family is essentially paying rent, what comes out of that rent, which is generally a market rent, so a family has to afford a market rent, what comes out of that rent is all the outgoings. It's the things like rates, insurance, but also obviously the loan repayments that we have been able to secure against the property. The difference between the rental payments and the outgoings is what we term the net qualifying rent. And over the period of 5 years, obviously there will be a difference between what the whānau is paying in rent and the outgoings. That difference, which let's assume is roughly $30,000 to $40,000, essentially becomes the deposit at year 5. So they've already built up at least $30,000 to $40,000 of paying down the value of that home at the year 5 period. From year 5 onwards, it's really paying down as much as possible on the property under the conditions of the long-term sales and purchase agreement, where Habitat is really the vendor and the family is what we term the purchaser in possession of the household. This is slightly different from obviously the previous landlord, well, very different from the landlord-tenant relationship. There are more responsibilities that fall on the whānau. It's almost as if they are owning that own home at the time in terms of responsibility for maintenance and some other repayments. And then at a certain point in that relationship, a whānau will be able to afford the home and purchase the home from Habitat. So just want to talk about the responsibilities through the process. So it's our responsibility as the community housing provider to develop or secure, a home that obviously meets all standards and set that affordable price point. This is becoming obviously a little bit more difficult in the sort of context within Tamaki Makaurau, but we are still able to do that, we feel. We are securing the favourable lending conditions, and how this remains affordable is in largely thanks to that current government fund that exists. As you will probably be aware, that fund provides 50% of either the purchase price or the development costs to the community housing provider. This 50% is provided at 0 interest. So the 50% that we have to secure from a bank or finance institution, we do our very best, obviously, to secure the lowest rates. And so the interest that's being charged on that full price of the home is usually kept currently at below 2%, because obviously we're only having to secure a loan on 50% of the price of the house. So in terms of the increase in value of a home, arguably it's kind of around CPI rather than a sort of increase in the interest rate. we, as Dominic has alluded to in his presentation, we do a huge amount of financial engagement and planning. Even from day one, it's really important, obviously, that the whānau is worked alongside to get to a point where they can own that home. It's very much in both parties' interests to secure home ownership at the earliest opportunity, because the more quickly we can turn around whānau, the more quickly for Habitat we can get on to do the next home and recycle those funds. And obviously for the whānau as well, certainly what we find in most cases, they want that independence, they want that home ownership, they want to be able to step away from the support of Habitat, and only rightfully so. So it's really important as we go through that process together that everyone's very transparent in finances, in communication, into where people are in their financial journey onwards to secure ownership. In terms of whānau responsibilities, obviously the application process is really important. It is a contested process. Julie alluded to the level of waiting list in just Queenstown alone of over 700 people. Obviously, we experience waiting lists like that as well. And because this is a contested process each time for our homes, we have many more people that apply than we can actually obviously house. So it's a contested process. The quality of that application is therefore really important. And then obviously developing that relationship from day one. You know, this is a 10-year relationship that we're going to have with each other. So the whakawhananatanga is really important, that we build that relationship, get to know each other. So specifically in times of trouble, which there will be bumps along the road, that you know, both parties are really open and willing just to come up with solutions to keep on track. Because I think we have to recognize this, and I'm sure it's the same for the other providers. There are bumps in the road, and because of our values and our mahi and what we represent, it's really important actually that, you know, we are not acting like a landlord or like a bank. We are acting like a partner in this journey, and we want to come up with solutions. If someone loses their job, someone passes away, there are additional costs. We understand that, and we want to just keep everybody on track through that process. So just in terms of why rent to own works as an affordable mechanism for home ownership. From day one, all the equity sits with the whānau. Habitat does not gain any equity on these properties at all. When the price is set at day one, whether that's a market price, which is rare these days, or the price that we fix that we consider affordable. So, for example, there is a 3-bedroom house that we'll be putting people in, or a number in Pukekohe in about 2 months. That price has been fixed at $650,000, and that will remain at that price. Now, that house will be probably valued at about $750,000, but that's not the price to whānau. So from day one, you're already, as a partner family, receiving around about $100,000 in equity gain. And then obviously you are starting to pay down the value of that home, what you owe Habitat essentially, through your net qualifying rent. As you go through the process, obviously, like we say, it's a 10-year process. As you gain and gain equity, as we assume that you will over 10 years, and show that strong repayment history, it makes the whānau very attractive for a bank. What we are generally finding now, and I appreciate that times change from year to year, but a whānau that was with us 6 or 7 years ago, most of those whānau are now able to settle because of the considerable equity gain that they have achieved in the last 6 to 7 years, and also being able to pay down through their net qualifying rent payments. Also, what's very important is that obviously we encourage KiwiSaver. It's actually, you know, it's a prerequisite of the program that a whānau has to have a KiwiSaver, and so this will also help when you come to purchase that that home. there it says PHO subsidy passed through to the partner family. I've already really discussed that. That's the subsidy that we receive in terms of the zero interest rate. So all of that is passed through to whānau. We don't clip the ticket on that. And again, like I say, there's an affordability point, and this is where it's quite important that we feel this conversation gets to with whānau. Over time, your rent is going to increase. If we assume a market rent from day one, and that rent is reviewed each year, that rent is just going to increase. However, there will come a point in time where the mortgage required to purchase the home from Habitat, the repayments on that mortgage is going to be less than your rent. Now, generally, we're finding that around about 7 to 8 years these days, particularly with low interest rates, you know, that's particularly favorable at the moment, and certainly even more so last year. But that's essentially where the affordability point is reached. And that's where we encourage and do our best to get whānau to settle at that point, because we feel at that time we have done our job. What we exist to get whānau into home ownership. At that point, they can afford home ownership. And so that's where settlement is highly encouraged before year 10. For some whānau, it doesn't work like that. And sometimes it takes a bit longer. We are flexible. Sometimes these relationships go beyond 10 years. And that, again, is appreciative of that. There can be bumps along the road, but we still want to hold. So while it is a 10-year umbrella agreement, of course, in any relationship and in any document, there is flexibility. Okay, so in terms of the key takeaways, for the community housing provider or whoever is providing this product, we need to be very careful that we are modeling what Habitat can afford, and more importantly, what the whānau can afford as it relates to household income. And Dominic alluded to this as well. This is the key point. The affordability is determined by families' household income. And generally the first starting point, regardless of house price, is actually what is that weekly market rent. Family needs to be working, they need to afford a weekly rent. That's generally a market. Secondly, obviously building that relationship. I mean, we all know that. The key to any relationship is good communication, and it's extremely important to hear. And that first 5 years, so the first 5 years, while there is an umbrella agreement, largely you're under rental agreement conditions. And this is where, obviously, if there are problems, the community housing provider does have the ability to end the relationship quite easily if things just aren't working out. Now, we hardly ever have to do this. I think in my time with Habitat, I know of one whānau that essentially we've had to kind of exit from the program, and that was a very extreme circumstance because the selection process is really important. You know, there's a number of interviews, there's a long application process, and the length of time that's required is again very important. This is not just a 1 or 2 month build up to signing an agreement to Habitat. It's longer than that, and and that's why getting it right is so important, because it's in no one's interests, the CHIP or the whānau, to fail through this process. So yeah. Once you're off that first 5 years and you've signed a long-term sales and purchase agreement, while it's not, I wouldn't say it's downhill from there, it's pretty much everyone's committed, and home ownership is not too far away from that point. Okay, that's all from me.
Tēnā koe, Conrad. Thank you for that presentation. Before we move to the panelists, I've got a few questions for you, Conrad. What household income are you targeting?
Yeah, so generally, so in Auckland now, we're looking at household income of probably a minimum of about $75,000. And we do go, there's not as, there is a maximum we like to hold to, which is around about $100,000 to $110,000, but as a minimum, it's about 75,000. It does change from case to case, because a lot of this is really dependent on how whānau is managing their debts, what their housing habits are, how many children there are. So all of these come into the equation as well.
What's the attrition rate like, Conrad? How many families fall through the process?
So we recently did this across the whole of Habitat, across Aotearoa, and of the 550 houses that we've built over that time, we've had 1.1% of whānau haven't made it. So a very small amount. And some of those will be for a myriad of reasons. Some of those, a lot of those is not because of affordability issues. Some is because of death in the family, etc. And so that, you know, it is outside of one's control, force majeure incidents.
With Habitat for Humanity as a current PHO provider, are there many homes available for whānau with 6 or more tamariki? And what's the average cost?
To be honest, an embarrassing show, the short answer is no. Not at this current time. It's certainly a challenge that that we have to overcome. The reality is it becomes a massive cost issue with the higher density, particularly in the last couple of years, that we can now have in Auckland. The cost of building a 4- or 5-bedroom home, which would be needed, is insane, actually, for want of a better phrase. And so you'd be looking at a cost of whānau of well over 1.3 million, something like that, probably, in terms. And so we're at the moment, it's a real challenge for the sector to provide homes that are above 3 bedrooms. And I would say that was probably true for the other providers in the room as well. But I don't think it's something that we can necessarily give up to, and I think that's a big challenge for actually future providers who potentially own the land, and to be more responsive to the exact needs of their members, and sort of to work around that when there is land available.
Finally, Conrad, does Habitat for Humanity partner with whenua Māori aspiring PHO providers?
Yes, I mean, at the moment we're working quite closely with Te Roroa Iwi in the Hokianga. I think I saw Talia online just earlier. So yeah, and they have aspirations to become a PHO provider. I think largely at the moment, I think I saw Donna Robinson from the Kirikirioa in the Waikato. I know that we're working quite extensively with them, but that's largely actually putting our products over their housing and housing their members. Generally, that's what's been happening. So I know with Ngātai Ki Tamaki, Waikato Tainui, they have produced the housing, they have owned the land, and we have purchased the homes from them, overlaid our PHO product, and are housing their tribal members into those homes. And we have, you know, there's very robust agreements that ensure that that happens, that iwi members are taking advantage of that relationship. And what's most important in all that, the affordable prices that those iwi are providing onto their members. So we actually, to be fair as well, I know they're not iwi, but Penina Health, who are a Pacifica chip, they're just starting their journey into the PHO space, and we are working directly alongside them, sharing our IP. And I think as well, I know that the other providers who are on this discussion today share everything with open hands, and we see that as very clearly part of our role as well.
Tēnā koe, Conrad, thank you for your presentation. Another question raised from Kahurangi Johnson for Julie was, if the person passes away, whose name the house is under and the children live in the house, can they live out the 100-year lease, or do they have to buy it? If they can live in it under the 100-year lease, what happens after that? And Julie has answered, as the lease, sorry, just As the lease will have a mortgage with the bank, this will become the main consideration if that leasee passes away. The bank would still require the home loan to be paid off. So if this were possible, e.g. if whānau moved into a home to look after the children and were able to take on the loan, then this could certainly be a way for the children to remain in the home. Alternatively, if the children were older and have the ability to take on a home loan themselves, then this could also enable them to stay in the property. Lots of questions here for Julie, but I'm going to try and flick one of the ones. So panelists, if you can all unmute, we've got a few questions here. We'll start with a question for Marlo. When will Māori organisations be given the opportunity to receive the financial support to set up their organisations so that they are able to progress with their Māori housing programs?
That's available at the moment in the Whai Kāinga Whai Oranga. So there is some capability support under He Taupua Fund, which is available on the HUD website for Whai Kāinga Whai Oranga. So that opportunity is available now.
Here's a question, I believe it's for Dominic. Does the Housing Foundation shared equity model work well in regional areas that don't see capital uplifts like Auckland?
Yeah, yes, it does. In fact, arguably, it probably works better in regions where the value uplift isn't as extreme. Because what's happening is, as prices rise, as we've seen rapidly rise through Auckland, household incomes don't. So the ability for whānau to buy out, as house prices increase, but their incomes don't increase, becomes actually harder. So in regions where value uplift is lower, prices rise slower, yeah, it's actually a far better product. Works well.
Question for Conrad. How has Habitat for Humanity accounted for the new RTA rules around ending tenancies?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I assume that the question is directly related to the right to transfer your tenancy now. If that is the case, we are working through it at the moment. What we believe is that our umbrella agreement is the overarching agreement, and because that umbrella agreement is essentially governs the process. If this does get tested, if this ever gets tested, obviously we will contest it, and we will test the efficacy of our umbrella agreement. I think that's all we can say for now. It's a bit of an unknown until this actually gets tested and we have a real example in front of us. We haven't addressed it because it's law, and we haven't addressed it in the umbrella agreement. I think we have to wait until that's tested.
Here's a question for Julie. What infrastructure does the Trust have to operationalise a program such as your leasehold model?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. We have a really small team. We currently have 2.75 full-time equivalent staff. When we first started back in 2007, I was a sole employee for 5 years. So I would suggest that it actually doesn't, in terms of staffing, human resourcing, it might not take that much and to get going. The one other thing I think is really important to remember, as Conrad pointed out before, is that established chips like ourselves are really happy to share our IP. So we've got all the secure home agreements. We've got a whole heap of learnings from the last 2.5 years. We want to share that with everyone freely. So you don't have to pay for the legal fees to get all that documentation set up. Come and use our IP. Come and use our documents. You look at our learnings. See what's worked, what hasn't. Dig into us and dig out information that you want. We're happy to share. So we want to grow the chip sector in New Zealand, and a way to do that is help smaller organisations get established and up and running.
The next question, I think this might be for you, Marlo. Do you have to be a chip to do PHO?
No. Thank you.
Question here from Rowley Fitzgerald. Are you all able to share numbers of whānau Māori and or Pacifica that have entered into your PHO product homes?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I wouldn't have the exact number, but generally it's for a habitat in my region, in Tamaki Makaurau and Tatai Tokoro, we're looking at about 78%, give or take. Obviously, that would change region to region quite significantly.
Ours is a bit lower. So we have in the Queenstown Lakes, we have a much lower Māori Pacific population compared to particularly the North Island and Auckland. So ours is a lot lower. I don't have the stats to hand, but I can tell you it's a lot lower than that. And particularly with the first development, the major one where we did the PHO, the Toru apartments, they were 1 and 2 bed apartments. So they're not particularly conducive for larger families. So in that situation, it's not going to be reflected a high level of Māori iwi, but certainly where we're, the next PHO funding that we've got is more 3 2-bedder homes, standalone homes. So the numbers there will be quite a bit higher.
Yeah, and for the Housing Foundation, the early days, I think probably our Māori Pacific representation was low. Over the last 5 years, I'd hazard a guess, and it is a guess, it would be about 70 to 75% Māori and Pacifica. And that's really reflecting now where the Housing Foundation is focusing its provision of affordable housing. You know, we're going into the communities where we know housing and home ownership is actually poorly represented by Māori and Pacifica households.
And Mark, from a current funding point of view, of the 166 houses that we've contracted with the current providers, 53 households have been housed at the moment. And the makeup of those 53 households, 28% are Māori, 22% are Pacifica, and 62% are families with children. So that's just from a program level at the moment. And those dates are as at the 30th of September.
Mark, yeah, sorry, just wanted to add, I think what we've been able to show between Julie and Dominic and myself is that while there's a wide body of work, there's still some considerable constraints that we have in delivering homes at an affordable level in some aspects, but also in the house size. And I think what's really encouraging now is that there is definitely a huge opportunity for Māori providers to actually do arguably a better job than we've been able to, and to house your people better. It's not, I don't think it should be a case of like, because we've done so many hundreds of houses, that should ever be seen as because you're starting from zero. I think the opportunities that do exist now, particularly under the current funding, do offer that gap that we in some ways have not been able to adequately fill because of the constraints that we've historically had, particularly around access to land. So I'd really encourage people to, get on it, because you're going to be able to do a better job than we are.
Another question for the panel is, does financial capability feature in the screening process for whānau, i.e. whānau learning the basic knowledge of home ownership?
I'll kick the answer off. For us, it's an absolute necessity. We're working with families who are sort of living on a sort of a hand-to-mouth environment, and so the ability for people to sort of see through and actually what they get as income, what they have to pay out as debt, is really hard to sort of sit back and actually look at that. So that's part of the skill set that we bring and the other CHPs bring to this, is actually taking on that role in the early days and sitting down at whānau and saying, let's look at your situation. Let's talk about it. And that's actually the hardest bit, is actually getting that conversation going. Once you got the conversation going, then you can sort of dig into how effective is it. And that's why we all run different programs, because some find would be better off in the early days, maybe being in a habitat home or being in a rent-to-home, own home, or in shared ownership. That's how you start to define the pathways for whānau to get into home ownership. It's so important. It's so important getting that understanding clear, for whānau to own that understanding as well, and then to work collaboratively to help them transition into ownership through whatever model works best for them.
Yeah, it's a lot of it is that shift from understandably short-term thinking week to week, And now whether that's due to affordability issues, or also just because one is renting and hasn't thought about home ownership. A lot of the families that we actually house had never even thought they'd be able to own a home. They hadn't even come across, and they almost threw in an application just for the hell of it because they saw an opportunity. That's great, but then if they have been approved, then that's where that journey of thinking long term. How do we say what's maintenance issues, what rates, all these other expenses that come out, and it's not easy for anybody to change that thinking overnight. That's why with particularly shared equity and rent to own, there is that long process of reaching that, and that's not just about affordability. That's also about changing habits, mindset, and planning.
Another question here, and this might be for you, Marlo, but I believe the others will know this. How many PHO or chips are there for Pacifica whānau New Zealand?
There are currently no approved, from HUD's perspective, PHO providers for Pacifica at the moment. There is one that we're working with at the moment, and they're partnering with Habitat for Humanity Northern at this stage, and that's Penina Health Trust. In terms of how many Pacifica chips there is only one, and that is Penina Trust up in Auckland. There is some work that the Ministry for Pacific Peoples is doing around trying to bring on more Pacifica chips. And that's a piece of work that's been led by themselves. So yes, unfortunately, there's only one in the chip space and none in the PHO space, but we're working on that.
Kia ora, Marlo. Just on that thread too, there's another question. If you're looking at Pacifica families, will the schemes look at the incomes from multiple people in the house?
Yes, so the current household eligibility for PHO, there is an income limit, and that's 130,000 for the household. That can be extended for multi-generational households, and that tends to be in Pacifica and Māori whānau or ainga. And there is a formula for that, and that's around, it can go up to 140% of the of the median household income for that region. Now, yes, that is a convoluted assessment, but that is on our website around the ability to look at multi-generational households.
Another question from Zola Rose. The collective housing sector is gaining in momentum. There are housing communities like co-housing, eco-village, and housing cooperatives that are being driven by groups who want to live there. Would PHO be available to these groups to apply to, and more intentional and values-based shared co-created neighbourhood development?
The short answer is yes, but I have to admit, Mark, I missed the first part. I have to admit, I missed the first part of the question in terms of who we're particularly focused on there.
Yeah, the question's probably for anyone that can answer it. The question was, the collective housing sector is gaining in momentum. These are housing communities like co-housing, eco-village, and housing cooperatives. Would PHO be available to these groups? Yeah,
yes, absolutely. I mean, the product is what it is, and if there's people want to utilize that product, and it fits within those. Obviously, there's a lease arrangement that needs to happen within Queenstown. There's a shared equity arrangement that's really important for ourselves. There's a title that gets transferred. You know, how that transfers into these types of cooperative situations will be complicated without a doubt. But that's not to say there's not a solution around it. Particularly Housing Foundation and Queenstown Lakes have had to work really hard in getting banks to understand their model. Ours is a little bit easier, to be honest, because it's Habitat owns the house, and then one point in the future the whānau does. So these challenges are always surmountable, but sometimes can take a lot of time and money to resolve.
Tēnā koe, Conrad. When you started out, Julie, did you do everything you know around the screening of families, negotiating contracts, etc.?
I'm slightly not sure about that question, but I think yes, we do everything. We screen the families, we negotiate contracts, we do everything in-house. So yeah. I saw, Mark, I just saw one other question in the Q&A that has been missed, and I would like to answer from Simpson Armand. He said, was the key to this development 100-year lease? For Māori land, we're restricted to a maximum of 51 years. In your experience, would this term work? And the answer is that I think yes. We have only been running our leasehold model for 2.5 years, so I couldn't answer definitively, but certainly our experience from shared ownership is that households stay in the property for around 5 to 7 years. We expect that under a leasehold, households will stay there for longer. It's hard to gauge at this stage because it's still relatively new, but I expect it may be 10 to 15 years. So I think offering a 50-year or 51-year lease would work. It's really how long a household will want to stay in that property, because remember, each time they sell back to you, the trust sells to a new household with a new 51-year lease. So there wouldn't be that many households, I imagine, who would actually stay in the property for 51 years. So I would think it would work for 99% of your transactions.
Tēnā koe, Julie. This might be a question for Malo, but it's open to everyone. Who are the Māori or non-Māori PHO partnerships in Te Tai Rāwhiti?
I don't think we've got any approved providers in that region. I do know that we've had a number of discussions with Te Rūnanga o Ngāti Porou to see how we can work effectively or engage with them. But this is what these webinars is about getting more providers interested in PHO, and happy to have those discussions with interested parties from Te Tai Rāwhiti going forward.
Kia ora koutou. I want to take this time to thank our panelists today that have come. We've already said farewell to Dominic, who was the CEO of Housing Foundation. Also want to thank Conrad Lapointe from Habitat for Humanity from the Northern region, and Julie Scott, our Queen down in Queenstown, who was talking about the leasehold model today. And finally to Malo Ayu, who's part of the HUD, the PHO, the manager for the PHO team. Hoi anō koutou, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou. Koutou e tāringa whakarongo mai ana, a tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou. Hoi anō koutou mā, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou. Huri noa o te motu, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. Ka mihi.